On behalf of Avid Learning, Consulate General of Canada in Mumbai, and ICIA Gallery, welcome to Beatlemania, Capturing Subcultures Through the Lens, a conversation between filmmaker and photographer Paul Saltzman and art critic and curator Girish Shahane. Of course, this discussion is based around this wonderful exhibition of photographs that Paul has taken of the Beatles' time in India. This program is a continuation of Avid's collaboration with ICIA Gallery with the generous support of Mr. Vikram Sethi and his team. Thank you to all of them. Avid has also had a long and fruitful collaborative relationship with the Canadian Consulate in Mumbai with structured programming and multi-partnered events like MAMI, KGAF, TIFF, National Film Board of Canada, and International Year of the Girl Child. These are some of the platforms and IPs that we have worked together on. To introduce tonight's program in a more detailed manner, I'd like to ask you to welcome Acting Consul General and Senior Trade Commissioner, Consulate General of Canada in Mumbai, Ms. Tara Sherwater.
So you're probably wondering why Canada is introducing or partnering on an exhibit about a British band. But what you see around you is a British band through a Canadian lens. And we're very happy to be able to partner with these strong partners tonight. So I also would like to share a big thanks to Vikram Sethi and the ICIA Gallery for this space and providing us with a location to hold this exhibit. And Asad Lalji and the whole Avid Learning team, they've done a great job in making sure that you were all aware that this event was happening. And they're always a good partner on a number of different projects that we have going forward. And finally, at the back, there are a few Brits in the room, so you'll notice that Reality Tours is here with us tonight, and you'll hear more at the end of the time about that. But if any of you are really keen on these photographs, you'll have an opportunity to both benefit youth at risk and also take a photograph home with you. Not necessarily tonight, but... Tonight we have the opportunity to talk a little bit more and hear a little bit more, not just to see these great photographs, but to talk a little bit about capturing subcultures through the lens. And to do that, of course, we have the Canadian content, the CanCon, which is Paul Saltzman. He's a two-time Emmy Award-winning film director and producer with over 300 dramas and documentaries to his credit. And in 1968, he was working on the very first IMAX film. I don't know if you know that that's Canadian technology, but it is. That's my little plug on the trade size. So he was working on the very first IMAX film, and that very same year, he also had the opportunity to learn meditation at the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi Ashram in Rishikesh. And that's where he had the opportunity to do that with a number of different talented individuals, including the Beatles, including Mia Farrow, Donovan, and others. And you'll see that in the photographs tonight. He's a published author and photographer, and his most recent book is The Beatles in India. So he's taken this experience and put it into a book, and we're looking forward to sharing that as well if you want to see it. With him tonight in conversation, we have a Mumbai-based art critic and curator. He was the editor and later consulting editor of Art India magazine, and was the director of the Skoda Prize for Indian Contemporary Art from 2011 to 2013, and the artistic director of Art Chennai in 2014, and the India Art Fair in 2015. Girish Shahane is well known to many people, and if you want to glean his thoughts and opinions, you can see them in a number of different publications, most notably Scroll.in, where he has a weekly column. I'd like to invite you both to come, and we're looking forward to your talk.
First of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for having me and for arranging it and for auctioning them off for a wonderful cause. That's beautiful. Well, it really started in Montreal. I was working for the National Film Board of Canada. I was 23. I thought I was successful as a young man. I'd already worked in the civil rights movement in Mississippi because I believed in it. I had been the star of my own television show. I drove a sports car. I dated. And I was working for the Film Board in Montreal, and I woke up one morning with a shocking thought. It was shocking, and I thought there were parts of myself I didn't like. And I hadn't been a very conscious young man. So that was shocking. And what happened next was very magical. I found myself about 15 years ago using the word magical like this more and more, and so I thought, I know what I mean, but what's the dictionary say? So I went to the Oxford Etymological Dictionary. I don't know if you've seen this. It's now all online, but in those days it was a huge book that was so small printing that they sold the book in a case with a magnifying glass because you couldn't read the print even if you had young eyes. And I looked up the word magic, and as I was reading down, there were 25 meanings, and I quickly understood that the first meaning was the most common, and then it went down in diminishing usage. And down at around number 23 or 24 was exactly what I was looking for. And it said, magic, quote, that which is real, but we as yet do not understand. That which is real, but as yet we do not understand, which is quite beautiful. So I had this shocking thought that there were parts of myself I didn't like. And then I sat up on the edge of my bed without thinking, and that's extremely important. One of the probably most important lessons I've learned from one of the sort of sages I've worked with. I found a number of sages in my life to help me on my conscious journey, because I wasn't very conscious at 23 years old. And one of the wisest things I've learned is that the goal in life is to integrate the head and the heart. To integrate the head and the heart. This is a wonderful computer. It's a shitty guidance system. This is a wonderful guidance system. It's a shitty computer. That's how I think of it. So I woke up, I had this shocking thought. I sat up on the edge of my bed, and without thinking, that's the key, without thinking, I heard myself say out loud, what do I do about this? And it just came out. I heard myself say it. Have you experienced that? Something comes out of your mouth, you hear it, but you didn't really think it first? I'm seeing a few nodding heads. Those are magic moments to hear it. So I sit up, I say out loud, what do I do about this? And I hear my soul talk to me for the first time in my life. And I've been brought up as an atheist, a left-wing communist, social activist. That was my background, my family background. My family were activists for social good. And I was brought up to believe there's no God, there's no soul, there's no spirit. But I hear inside me, to my shock, a very deep, resonant, all-loving, all-calming voice. And it says, well, Paul, if you really want to look at yourself more carefully, you might want to get away from the environment you grew up in. And I say out loud, without thinking, it was this odd conversation, I say out loud, where do I go? And that inner voice says, India. And I had no connection with India, no interest, no connection. I didn't know meditation, mysticism, none of that was part of my even awareness. But I didn't have enough money to get to India, and I was working at the film board, so I went to a director who I knew was going to do a documentary in India, and I said, I'd like to work on your film. And he said, I'm not taking anyone from here. I'm picking up a director of photography in London, and I'm picking up a local sound man in Bombay. It was then Bombay, and there were no sound women in those years. And then there was silence. There was silence, and in that moment, I learned the power of silence, because I didn't know what to say. And instead of filling the emptiness, I stayed quiet. And he said, have you ever done sound? And lying through my teeth, without a hesitation, I said, absolutely. And he said, okay, you get yourself to Bombay, and I'll pay you the same as I'll pay the Indian sound man. And I said, how much is that? He said, $500. I said, thank you. We shook hands. And I went to the phone and I called the airlines and I said, how much is a ticket to India? And they said, $550. So I had my airfare because I couldn't afford it otherwise. And then I phoned the best sound engineer in Toronto at the time, Patrick Spence Thomas. My friend Penn is a filmmaker, and we both knew Patrick very well. And I said to Patrick, can you teach me sound? He said, sure, come on over. So that's what brought me to India. I was deeply in love with Trisha, my girlfriend. She didn't want me to go. She cried a lot. I cried a lot. I didn't want to leave her. We both cried a lot. And I left for India, and I did the sound recording on the film board film, which was, you might find this interesting, it was the first atomic reactor that India had. And it came from Montreal, and the calandria, the container that holds the atomic reaction, was 4 inches thick stainless steel, and it was huge. It was the size of this room and triple the height. And they had to ship the trucks, and it took 2 years to lower roads and raise bridges and move power lines so that it could go from Bombay to Kota in Rajasthan. And we were filming this. We were filming the process. So I worked on the film. I got to Delhi. I excitedly opened the first letter from my girlfriend, and the first line was, "Dear Paul, I've moved in with Henry." It is much funnier today. So I was devastated, and somebody who I knew for 3 days in my life said, "Why don't you try meditation for the heartbreak?" I said, "I'll try anything." He said, "I'm going to hear Maharishi Mahesh Yogi speak at New Delhi University tonight. Do you want to come?" I said, "Yes." We got lost. We arrived late. The auditorium was jammed. We literally pressed up against the back wall. And I only remember one thing the Maharishi said. He said, meditation takes you beneath and below your daily worries and concerns to a place of inner rejuvenation from which you come back renewed and refreshed. And I thought, that's what I need. So I took a train to Rishikesh. I didn't make any arrangements, which in the end was serendipitous, because if I'd made arrangements, they would have said the ashram's closed and we'll teach you in Delhi. Yeah. But I got to the ashram, and it was closed, and the young man who came to talk to me, Raghavendra, said, "I'm sorry, the ashram's closed, so the Beatles and their wives are here." I didn't know they were in India. I was a fan, but more than a fan, when I first heard the song Tomorrow Never Knows, I remember my girlfriend Trisha and I smoked a joint, and we lay down on the grass, took out a stereo with a long yellow cable, I can remember, and we lay on the grass, and she had her head on my shoulder, and we were listening to Revolver. And then Tomorrow Never Knows is the last song. And I remember listening to it, and when it ended, I literally thought, what are they talking about? Void, go towards the light, inner peace. And in that moment, what happened was I thought, well, it sounds like they're talking about something real. Felt that way. And I thought, if they are talking about something real, it's something my parents and my teachers had never told me about. So that was the beginning of my awakening to something. Mm-hmm. But then time goes by, and the human condition, we get busy, we get lazy, we get unconscious, and all those different things. So I waited outside the gate for 8 days, and then I was allowed in, and I learned 8 days. I didn't know what to do. I was.
You were sleeping at the gate, or
Raghavendra,
guest house?
Good question. Raghavendra, who was the one who came down and said, "I'm sorry, the ashram's closed," and I said, "Can I wait?" And he was a little taken aback, and he said, "Oh, okay." And there were 2 army tents across the path under the trees. Mm-hmm. That were empty. One of them was used by a tailor from the town of Rishikesh who came up every day and made these made-to-measure clothes for people. And the other army tent was empty, so he said, "You're welcome to sleep in the second tent, and we'll send you our simple vegetarian meals." So this man was an angel. This man was an angel. I looked for him when I did my first book because I wanted to say a different kind of thank you. I said thank you, but years later I wanted to really, and he was already gone. He wasn't living. So I waited 8 days, and then I was allowed in. Raghavendra said, "Come on in." He taught me meditation. It took 5 minutes. He said, try it, and I tried it. He said, what are you experiencing? I said, well, my knee is hurting because I had never sat cross-legged, right? North America, who knew? Cross-legged? You know, there wasn't yoga in, you know, there's always been yoga. There's always been meditation, but in 67, 68, yoga was almost unknown in North America. Meditation was almost unknown. Vegetarian eating, almost unknown. And a lot of these things, I believe, came through the Beatles and the interest that occurred because people said, what are they doing over there? So I said, my knee is hurting and the dog barking outside, I'm getting distracted. And Raghavendra said, that's okay. When you notice you're not doing your mantra, don't wrestle with it or you'll be out of the meditation. When you notice that you're not doing your mantra, just gently choose to go back to it. And he said, I'll now leave you alone to meditate on your own. You're now welcome to spend your days in the ashram and take your meals with us. These were his exact words. But there's no extra beds, so you'll have to sleep in the tent. I said, great, thank you. I did one 30-minute meditation. I transcended twice. And at the end of the 30-minute meditation, it was an absolute miracle. The agony in the heart was gone. The knife in the heart was gone. I'd had this weird experience, weird meaning because it never happened before or since. When the heartbreak happened, I could hear a screaming in my head. I could hear a screaming in my head, and it was me. It was me. And I thought, if I let it out, I'll drown in it. Now, I now know, being wiser, that you let it out. That's what you do. Let your pain out. Unfortunately, a lot of people in our world let their pain out by punishing others. But just let it out non-violently. And so in a 30-minute meditation, the scream was gone, the knife in the heart was gone. I open my eyes, I come out into the sunlight, I'm stoned. It's like I'd smoked a joint or two. I was in bliss, who knew? And the heartbreak was gone, and I'm wandering through the ashram. The Beatles are not in my mind at all, not a thought. I'm just so relieved not to be in agony. So that's how it started. Only as a participant and an observer, not as someone who studied it, but there's value in not studying it, but living it. I don't mean that to be a superior than studying it. 68 was a period of great conflict between generations. You know, the Prague Spring, the student strike in Paris, the whole Vietnam War, demonstrations. It was a period, the 60s were an extremely volatile period. You know, people talk about the 60s, as you know, as being a new age. And I believe that's true, but we have to be very careful, I think, about what we say about or how we define it. I believe it was a new age because I believe there was a shift in consciousness in the 60s. Part of it was the civil rights movement, the demonstrations against Vietnam, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a desire to also explore consciousness on a different level. I think, and again, these are just my observations, we came out of the Second World War, and people were devoted to safety after a world war or after a huge war. And part of safety was economic safety. And then the next generation, I think, finding their parents maybe more focused in the material because that was necessary for them, but an absence of the spiritual. And I think that was part of, including the revolt or young youth revolt against repressive politics. The shift from alcohol, which is a depressant, to marijuana, which is not a depressant. So, in the 60s, I was a hippie, whatever that means. My hair was to here. Me and my friend Freddie gave out flowers on the busiest streets of Toronto in bare feet, and some motorists took the flowers and some swore at us, which I came to understand. Here we were in our long, flowing clothes that were mostly Indian fabrics, by the way. Beautiful fabrics, as you know. And people stuck in commuting rush hour would resent the freedom of the, the giving out of flowers. I'm not sure if that's addressing what you meant. So I come out of the meditation, I'm stoned, I'm walking through the ashram. They are literally not in my mind. They don't exist. And I'm just so relieved to be in bliss, to be out of agony, and I'm just walking along. The ashram's small. How many of you have been to the ashram? Yeah, it's cool. It's not big, right? Quarter of a mile by quarter of a mile. And at some point, I just am looking around, and I see John about 150 feet away sitting at a table, and I can tell that Paul's sitting opposite him from his back. And this was so interesting. Without thinking, I just found myself curving towards them. It wasn't a thought. I just found myself curving towards them. And I'm about halfway to them, and in this altered state, I just notice, oh, my heart's beating a little faster. But I wasn't taken. I was just, so I get to the edge of the table, and there's John and Paul and George and Ringo and Patty Boyd and Cynthia Lennon and Maureen Starkey and Jane Asher's with Paul and Mia Farrow and Donovan and Mike Love of the Beach Boys and Mal Evans, their roadie, 12 of them. And they're just chatting, and I happen to approach, so I'm at the end of the table, and I didn't want to interrupt their talking, so I just stood there, and then after a moment they stopped because somebody was standing there. And John looked up at me, and I just said, with complete calm, not being in this altered state, which was a blessing, I said, may I join you? And John says, sure, mate, pull up a chair. Paul turns to me and says, come and sit here. And I sit next to Paul. And then 3 magical things happened, right? Back to the magic. As soon as my bum hits the seat, to my shock, I hear in my head, eek, it's the Beatles. Now, I saw them live in Toronto in 1964, and I wasn't screaming. I was like this, trying to hear the words over everyone screaming. 18,000 people in Maple Leaf Gardens. I'm just trying to hear the words. And you could hear about 1 out of every 3 words because of the screaming. And as soon as that finished, eek, it's the Beatles, I hear my soul talk to me for the second time in my life. Before I have a chance to think, before I react to that weird thing in my head, eek, it's the Beatles, I hear my soul talk to me for the second time. Very calm, very loving, very all-knowing. And it says, hey, Paul. It keeps saying, hey, Paul. I think it was trying to make sure I was hearing, right? Said, hey, Paul, they're just ordinary people like you. Everyone farts and is afraid in the night. That's what it said. And from the moment it finished, I'd spent a week sitting with them, and I never thought of them as the Beatles. It was not even a thought. At which point, the third magical thing is, before I have a chance to think, which was great, John turns to me, and in his wry, digging wit, toying with me, playing with me, he says, so you're American then? And I say, no, Canadian. And he turns to the rest of the group and he says, ah, he's from one of the colonies. As most of you are, right? At which point he turns back to me and he says, so you're still worshiping Her Highness then? And I say, no, not personally. And then Ringo and Paul start teasing me about having the Queen on our money, which we still have. And they start teasing me about having the Queen on our money, and I say, well, we may have the Queen on our money, but hey, she lives with you guys. So we're all laughing. And then John turns back to the rest of the group and he says, ah, you see, they still have a sense of humor in the colonies. And that was it. They took me into their group. And when I thought of it afterwards, I didn't think at the time, it was the play, just playing with each other. So I spent a week with them. And what was really, again, magical was I never wanted anything from them. I had a broken heart. I came for a giant aspirin. I got it in meditation. I was in joy. I didn't need anything from them. they had played an important part in my life. Tomorrow never knows. And here I am years later, and I'm discovering that inner journey.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, turn off your mind and float downstream. It's happening.
Yeah.
So I never thought of asking for a picture with them, and I could have had plenty. I never thought of asking for an autograph. When I left a week later, I turned to walk away. I said goodbye to John. Ringo was leaving with me, and Maureen, and I started to walk away from the table by the cliff, and John said, "Hey, Paul, will you send us some of your pictures?" So I turned around and said, "Sure," at which point Jane Asher said, "Here, take my home number. If you call Apple, you'll never get through to them." Hi, John wanted some of my click. I'm sure the gazillion Beatles fans tried everything, right?
Yeah.
So I met Jane Asher. I was working on that first IMAX film, and 6 months later I was going through London, and I called Jane, and I couldn't afford color, so I printed 4 black and white poster-size pictures, and I met her for a cup of tea in Kensington for half an hour. She was very dear. I gave her the pictures rolled up. I didn't even think of giving her my business card to say, "Let me know." I had this awareness that they didn't need new friends. You know, their lives were crazy, and I didn't need anything. You know, again, we're complex bunnies, you know, and without it being disrespectful, we were babies. I had just turned 24. George was 24. Paul was 25. Ringo was, I think, 28, and John 27. I'm not sure. Siddharth, I noticed you just came in. Siddharth?
That's yeah.
What was Ringo a year older than John?
Yeah.
October, I think.
Yeah, he was
Yeah, a year older.
6 months
Joined
older.
later.
Right. Yeah.
Ringo was the oldest.
Yeah.
He was the oldest Beatle.
He was the oldest Beatle.
He was born in 40.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was about 6 months older, I think, than John.
So I think what happened is, you know, they came to learn meditation. As we know, George was the motivator, and he was the most devoted to it. I'd say John was second most devoted to it, just from the talk. Ringo and Paul
Yeah.
did meditate. I don't know what it meant to them or not. But, you know, you touch a deeper part of yourself, and it takes you in a new direction.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I also think that in terms of the breakup, and, you know, all of us can have a different take on it.
Yeah.
To me, they were very young, and they didn't know how to hold the cauldron of change. You know, we all know the story, or I guess we do, that wives and girlfriends were not allowed in recording sessions, and now John's bringing Yoko in, and she's sitting under the mixing board, and she's in the room. John was an idiot to do that. But that's just me saying he was an idiot. It was a break of trust, and they didn't know enough of how to talk to each other. I mean, how many of us have been married and you have real challenges in what I saw was they were brothers. When I was at the ashram, they were that close, and you could tell that the wives were an outer circle, not far away, but not part of the 4 of them. And one of the stories that I find most sort of illustrative was, maybe you know this, when they first played in New York, and the Beatlemania was exploding, and I think it was Shea Stadium first, wasn't it? Shea Stadium first?
In US it was Ed Sullivan show.
Yes, and then Shea Stadium?
Yeah, the biggest.
Yeah.
Most public performance.
Yeah.
Yes. And they had a whole floor, and I forget, the Pierre Hotel, one of the hotels, they...
Whole floor. Yeah.
Yeah, so they had a whole floor. And after the first concert, they were so whatever that they all went into one bathroom on this whole floor. They went into one little bathroom, closed the door, and started smoking cigarettes together. Right? Or maybe it was joint, I don't know. But they had to pull back together because the energy, you know, why do so many rock and roll stars get in trouble with alcohol and drugs? The energy is so powerful. You have to be very grounded and very grown up to deal with that kind of adulation. So, you know, they were at the ashram, they were that close. After that, you know, they touched a place in themselves that was deeper and their needs were different.
Yeah.
They were evolving, positively, negatively, whatever you want to say.
It was.
I had a very lovely thing happen with Mia Farrow, and I'll share the story, although it pretty much reflects on what a nice guy I am, so I'm a little awkward to do that. Or maybe what a nice guy I was, whatever. So I get the letter from my girlfriend. I'm devastated. I'm staying at the Oberoi Hotel in Delhi. The film is finished, so I'm now off the budget. But I don't have any money because I spent it all getting there. And I'm coming out of the Oberoi the day I'm supposed to check out. I'm wearing white kurta pajamas because they're the most comfortable clothes in the world. It's like you're not wearing anything, right? They're just, it's beautiful, and yet, and there's a whole bunch of news media outside the hotel, 20, 30 people milling about. So I stop and I wonder what's going on. As I'm wondering what's going on, 2 white Ambassador cars quickly pull in, and they just swarm the cars, cameras and microphones and cinema cameras. And as I watch Mia Farrow and Prudence, because I know them from pictures, they can't get out of the car. 3 managers come out, the doormen push the media away, and they make a path, and Mia and Prudence go in. And I follow them in through the next door over because I'm just watching, and a cameraman, a very enterprising cameraman, runs all the way around the hotel, and there's a side entrance, and he runs in the side entrance, and he runs up behind Mia yelling her name, Mia, Mia, so she'll turn around so we can get a picture. She turns around and I see the terror in her face, terror and vulnerability. So she's just come off the marriage with Sinatra. She was pretty devastated. She was, I forget, 19 or something? I forget how old she was.
20, yeah.
20. And the cameraman runs up and she just hits him across the head with her purse, just to defend herself. So they show the cameraman out, and she and Prudence are put into the elevator, and they're gone. And I felt so badly for her. I just felt badly. So I wanted to do something. So I went to the flower shop in the Oberoi, and I bought a big, giant yellow mum, you know, those wonderful, huge things. And I go to the front desk, and I go up to one of the young women who's on the front desk, and I say, do you know what room Mia and Prudence are in? And she says, I can't tell you, sir. And I say, I just saw what happened. And she had seen it, and I said, I just feel badly, and I'd like to give her the flower just to make her day a little bit better. And the young woman whispers, Maharaja sweet. Very dear of her. So I go up to the floor, and I walk down the long hall, and I knock on the door, and I knock on the door again, and then the door opens, and it's Prudence. And I say, is Mia in? And she says she's resting. And I just said, I saw what happened downstairs. I just hope this makes her day a little bit better. And I give her the flower. And I leave. And that's fine. That was the end of it. I'm in the ashram a couple weeks later, and coming towards me along the path, there are Mia and Prudence. And I just said hi, and hi to each of them, and I wasn't going to say anything. And as they pass, I hear Prudence saying, Mia, that's the nice man from the hotel. And Mia turns around and she comes right up to me and she said, it made a difference. And that was it. So, you know, I was around her. I took a couple of pictures of her, but we never really had an in-depth conversation. But she was, I'll tell you, she was really bright. She was very smart and very delicate in the positive and very sensitive in the positive.
How soon after meeting them did you start photographing them? Because being a photographer in sort of a group of people is always a special position. You know, you're always sort of, you can be friends with them, but it's always you're slightly a voyeur in a sense. So how did that come to be? Like how soon after meeting them you start taking a camera and sort of photographing?
Well, the good news is I wasn't a photographer, and I've never been a professional photographer. I liked taking pictures as a kid. I was saying to Ashok back there that my first real camera was a Yashica 44, and I would take pictures because I liked, I had some kind of sense of it. So when I met them, so I had a camera in my backpack and I had lots of film because I was on a journey to find myself, really. As I said, I thought I would go around the world. I didn't think it would stop in India. And after the first 2 or 3 days of sitting with them, they were taking pictures all the time of each other. It was like a family outing, right? They had the most expensive Nikons. I had the cheapest Pentax. I had 2 lenses, a 50 and a 135. I had Ektachrome 64. And I knew so little about photography technically. I didn't have a light meter. And when you open up the film, there's this Kodak, there's a little folded of paper, and you open it up and it's a picture of a sun, and it says F22, and then F16 is 3/4 of a sun, and F11 and all that. That's how I got my exposures. Fortunately, Ektachrome 64, it turns out, had a 2-stop latitude, so it corrected any errors I made mostly. So just seeing them take pictures of each other, because I literally didn't think of them as the Beatles after that first 30 seconds. But I did ask them individually. So I waited until there was a moment that I was alone and with each one, and I said, do you mind if I take pictures? And each of them said, oh, go right ahead, because they had taken me into their group. I only took out my camera twice. I took 72 exposures. 54 of them have anyone famous. Probably 40 of them have a Beatles in it. So not much. And there was what you were saying, there was no sense of separation. We were just hanging out. It was like family picnic time, that's all. And I think the reason they're so intimate was simply 2 things. One, I didn't want anything from them. And I think when you're that rich and famous and powerful, everyone wants a piece of you. And your radar has to be very good or you're going to get screwed. So, as they did by Magic Alex. So, it was just that we were hanging out, that's all.
Would you guys eat together, and how's the condition during your stay? I heard Ringo was upset because he didn't like the condition, how he had to, the food and all, he'd bring beans with him. He brought a lot of cans of beans, that's what I heard.
Right. The conditions were lovely. They were simple but lovely. I slept in the tent, but the rooms that I was in, the rooms were clean. The rooms were the bungalows were newly whitewashed because the Beatles were coming. Those big buildings you see at the ashram and you see in pictures, none of them existed in '68. They were all small bungalows that had a very simple kind of feeling. Ringo had stomach problems from a young age. I've read when he was 6 or 7, he was hospitalized, so he brought a suitcase of beans. Mal Evans told me his first duty every morning was to go down to the village and buy fresh eggs and come up and make eggs and beans for Ringo. When Ringo left, Dennis O'Dell, the head of Apple Films, came the day I left and the day Ringo left. And Ringo apparently said to Dennis, look behind the door, there's a half suitcase of beans, because he wasn't taking them with him. As we were getting in the cars, there were 2 taxis. Mal called 2 taxis. And we went down to Delhi together. And we're standing by waiting for the taxis, and then they arrive. And I said to Ringo, hey, how come you guys are leaving? He did not say it was the food. That was a cover story for the press. He said, we're missing the kids, and Maureen doesn't like the flies. Now, I didn't notice any flies, but apparently, as it's been written, she had a phobia, and one of Ringo's important responsibilities when they went to bed each night was to make sure there were no bugs in the room. So they weren't leaving because of the food.
I
think what's fascinating is that you got to meet Ringo afterwards as well. That photo was used in one of his album covers, so one of the layers, you know. He requested that from you. So after meeting the Beatles and everything, you met them then maybe 30 years later, you know, some of them.
Right.
What was that response like when the book came out and suddenly you discovered, oh my God, this is something that nobody has seen before?
My experiences with him afterwards, and like I said, I didn't try and keep in touch. And that was honestly, I didn't need anything, didn't want anything. What I got at the ashram was gold, meditation, a connection with my soul. What I had been looking for, which was a giant aspirin for the heartbreak, and a connection, a method to connect with my own inner life. So, you know, I was in heaven. I lucked out on the level. When I say lucked out, I want to say I believe fully that when we listen to that inner voice, when we listen, call it your heart, call it your soul, when you listen to the inner voice, it's your best friend, and it always knows what's best for you in terms of love and heart and all of that. And the key to living well, I believe, is making friends with your own inner, I call it my higher self, which I think is different than the soul, but probably what Christians call your guardian angel. But it's not something outside. It's you. It's the fully evolved you. At any rate, so I met Ringo, once. I got a call from his record producer, who I knew, Mark Hudson at the time, who said Ringo would like one of your pictures. And I said he can have any of them or all of them for free as a matter of respect, any size. And he said, no, he just wants one picture. Which one? The one that's called To the Nines with the gold Nehru jacket. And I said, I'm happy to give it to him on one condition. And Mark said, what's that? I said that I give it to him and that you take my picture with him, because I have no pictures with any of the Beatles. So many years later, I'd gotten smarter or something. So it was arranged, and he was performing in New York with his band, and I met him in a rehearsal hall and listened to him rehearse for 45 minutes. I had my camera with me, and it took me half an hour to think, oh, I have a camera in my hand. So I walked up to where there was no one there. There was their two roadies and the Mark and the Roundheads, I think they are, and Ringo. And I went up to the stage and I just pointed to the camera, and Ringo went like this and Mark went like this. So I took a whole bunch of pictures. I've never done anything with them. You know, same thing. I don't need to do anything with them. And afterwards, Ringo came up to me. They took a break and he came up to me and we shook hands, and he said, you must have been 16 years old at the ashram. And I said, no, but thank you. And then I gave him the picture. Mark took a picture of it on my camera, so I have the picture. I asked him if he wouldn't mind signing the pages, the proof pages from my limited edition book, and he was kind of grumpy as anything about it. I guess a lot of people, I've never done anything with them. They were for me. I didn't sell them. I'm not selling them, but I don't think. He made a grumpy comment as if I was using him to make money. Wasn't true, but I guess, you know, a lot of people do that, and you get to feel ripped off and exploited. No, I did meet him twice, that's right. When he was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame as the first drummer to be inducted without a band as a solo, I got a call from his people. They'd like to do there was a big opening, and could they use some of my pictures from Rishikesh? And I said, sure, and I said, on one condition. And they said, what's that? And I said that I get 2 tickets to the reception at the Grammy Museum. So my sweetheart Annie, who I'd met a month before, but we were already a deeply connected couple and still are. So I asked her if she wanted to come, and the place was jammed. You couldn't move. And I wanted to introduce Annie to Ringo. I said, would you like to meet him? She said, of course. So we make our way slowly pushing through the crowd. And I say, hi, Ringo, Paul Saltzman, the Beatles in India, blank. And you know, I don't expect to be remembered. Geez, Why would, these people have millions of people pass through their lives, or many. Blank. And I said, I'd like you to meet my sweetheart Annie. He gave her a big hug. She was delighted, and that was enough, right? With Paul, I sent each of them my first limited edition book. And again, I didn't want anything. It's a matter of respect. I wouldn't have these photos if it wasn't for their friendship, their kindness. His assistant, Paul's personal assistant, phoned me back and said, Paul thanks you, and he said it's a work of art. I said, lovely. I've never used that to sell the book. I probably should. I think I'm a little retarded when it comes to marketing, right? So, but a few years later, I've been wanting to make a film on the Beatles' time in India, specifically about creativity. What I understood was they wrote 48 songs in just about 48 days, because Paul told Dennis O'Dell that number of 48. There's some question of that. Mark Lewisham, who's considered the preeminent Beatles historian, is in my film. It's not finished, but I've shot it. And Mark said, well, Dennis, I know Dennis, and it sounds right, but there's only 30 songs that we can find. So I think it's 30 songs. But, a historian looks for validation. But Paul told Dennis 48, so I believe 48. What the heck? And so I want to make a film, and I have shot it, we're editing it, which is really about creativity and meditation and the inner journey, and that time at Rishikesh. So it took me a long time to get a meeting with Paul that was going to be in Toronto when he was performing. And I was shown to the green room, and an hour late, and there's other people in the green room, his aunt something who lives in Toronto and other people. And he had a problem with the sound check, and he arrived an hour late, and he goes around the room, and he came to me, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm running late, and let's get a picture, one of those pictures. And he turns to his assistant and said, book him in for tomorrow, because he was doing 2 concerts. And the next day, that person was very kind. She phoned and said, I'm sorry he's running late. I'm sorry he's running late. And I got pushed from 11 in the morning till I fell off the day, and I never got to see him. And I haven't been able to get to him ever since, which is life. But something very sweet happened. In 2009, I think, the concert, the fundraiser for the David Lynch Foundation at the Radio City Music Hall, first time Ringo and Paul played together on the same stage, right? I think it was 2009. Do you know, was it 2009? Anybody around 2009? Around then. I get a phone call. My phone rings in my house, and a woman says, is this Paul Saltzman? Yes. Is this the Paul Saltzman who was at Rishikesh in 1968? Yes. And she says, and she says her name, and at MPL Productions in London, I know that's Paul's company, she said, Paul asked me to phone you. That's very sweet. I said, yes. She said, he's going to be doing a fundraiser at the Radio City Music Hall, and the second last song is Cosmically Conscious, and he'd like to use your photographs for a slideshow on the backdrop. Would that be possible? And I say, sure. And she says, how much will that be? And I say, nothing, free. And there's this long silence, like really, beat, 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 beat. And finally I say, why does that surprise you? And she says, this has never happened before. And I say, how do you mean? And she said, when people hear it's Paul McCartney, they want a lot of money. And I said, same thing. I said, I wouldn't have these pictures if it weren't for the 4 of them. I named a generosity. So free on one condition. She said, what's that? I said, you give me a copy of the video, because it was a video for my archive. So she said, good. And I said also that because they wanted 200 megabyte files. Well, I've never given anyone files like that. But she said, Paul is ferocious about protecting copyright. So we signed a 1-page agreement. I asked for a 1-page agreement. that they would use it for that one purpose only, that I would get the copy from my archive, and that they would guarantee, which you can't really ever get, that they would wipe the files, both at the printers and at whatever they did. And she said, would you like tickets to the concert? And for some reason, I can't remember, I was working, something happened and I couldn't go, but Eddie Vedder and Ringo and Paul, and stunning. You watch the video online, it's incredible. So I never could get back to Paul. And I've dealt with Apple off and on for 13 years to get them to work with me on the film, and I can't get, their, the all you need is love stuff. Apple is a capitalist company for good reasons, and they protect their copyright because people rip them off all the time. And I think one of the things that happens is that they don't know their friends from their enemies. Like, I don't want anything. I'm not going to rip them off. Can we work together? I'll pay you for the music, right? But it's a little more complicated.
Because we were talking about Ringo, leaving early, 13 days to be precise. I had read this somewhere that the Beatles came to India for a very pure or a sacred experience, right? But somehow Ringo found out that if you could bribe the servants or people helpers working in the ashram, you could smuggle in cigarettes or alcohol inside the ashram. So he realized this isn't that pure or sacred as they had thought it should be. So that was kind of turn off for him, and that was the reason Ringo left the ashram. How true is this claim? I had read this somewhere. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't have any information. I never saw alcohol. I never saw cigarettes. I never saw marijuana. I was with them for a week. Ringo was there, my understanding was he was there for 11 days, Paul for 5 weeks, John and George for about 8 weeks. So I was only there for a week, so my observation is limited. But I saw nor did I hear anything about any of that. And as I said, he left for reasons he told me that had nothing to do with alcohol or drugs. So, people tell stories, and I don't know if they're true, I can't say.
Yes.
We've talked about this before. There's no Donovan.
No Donovan?
There's no Donovan.
Yes, there's one picture here. There he is.
Smoking too. Yeah.
No problem.
There's no Donovan story. I thought he was the guy who brought them together.
Yeah, well, I can tell you a couple stories. I think they're in his books, although he told me this. About 30 years afterwards, 30? No, yeah, 40. About 40 years afterwards, after I found the pictures, 33 years afterwards, after I found the pictures, my daughter reminded me of them because I put them away and literally forgot about them. And she reminded me of them, and then I did the first book called The Beatles in Rishikesh. That was with Penguin Putnam in New York, the Viking imprint, and they really ruined the printing. They paid no attention. And so the pictures look terrible. I mean, you see the picture of George behind the close-up? How beautiful his eyes and face are? In my first book, you can't see his eyes. It's so dark. They picked the wrong paper. Whatever they did, they used the wrong ink. So when I got the book, it's beautifully designed, but the pictures look like crap. And in that moment of getting the first book, I literally thought, one day I'll do it myself, and I'll do it right. Because I understood that in that moment, I'd never done a book. If you don't pay for it, you don't get to call the shots. So 5, 6 years later, I had enough money that I could create and produce my own limited edition books, and the pictures look fabulous. And there is a new edition, The Beatles in India, this past February, which is also terrific quality but not expensive. The limited edition books are expensive because they cost a lot to make. But yes, so I met Donovan at a Beatles convention in New Jersey. I didn't even know there were Beatles conventions, right? Like, their music was life-changing for me. Meeting them was life-changing, but I'm not the kind of fan who ran after them. I've never read a book about the Beatles. The experience was my real experience. So that's just my way of doing things. So I run into Donovan, and we're at the same Beatles convention, and we both want to kind of hang out. So we spent about 3 hours that night from about 11 till 2 in the morning in his hotel suite. He's a lovely man sitting with his guitar, and he's playing his guitar, and then he puts it down, and we're chatting. And so he told me some stories, and most of you, if you've read his book, you may know this story. But for example, he told me about the first time he met the Beatles. It's a wonderful story. How many of you have heard this? First time Donovan? Okay, so Donovan is in London, and it's the Vietnam War period, and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez are, as I said in my film, joy is a state of creativity, and creativity is a state of joy, and that's what I observed. Anyway, at one point they paused, and then they kept going. And Paul looked up at me, because I'm sitting right there, and that's when I took the picture, and Paul said, "That's all there is so far. We don't have any of the words yet." But that was the only experience I had where I was consciously aware of something new that I then heard on the White Album.
But let's say I'll use the microphone. All right, well, my name is Etienne. I work at the Consulate General of Canada here in Mumbai, working on political, economic, and public affairs. So it's a great pleasure for us to have you tonight. Thank you for taking the time to come, for participating with so much energy. And I'd like to thank both of our speakers for a very enlightening talk tonight and very interesting. We talked about joy, we talked about love, we talked about discovery, we talked about, finding ourselves, maybe not finding peace for some people, but some other people did. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time as well to come here on your busy schedule. And I'd like to offer you a little something from Canada to mark your presence here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.